My name is Andrea Miller. I'm with People Demanding Action. I've got a microphone. I can get really loud and get really scary. So let's quiet it down, please. Yes, human rights. Our panel today is going to talk about a lot of different things that go on in the kingdom. They're going to be looking at the judicial system, torture, forced confessions, counterterrorism. We've already heard some talk about what goes on with women, the guardian system, the women's rights, the fact that Saudi Arabia still has the death penalty. Gee, so do we. All right. A lot of unfortunate coincidences or not. U.S. Western arms sales to Saudi Arabia, Saudi bombardment of Yemen, and some possible things that we can do. Past efforts that Congress has made to challenge human rights violations in Saudi Arabia, and possible left-right coalitions. Every once in a while, it does get very useful that the Tea Party is in Congress. I said every once in a while, not all the time. Every once in a while, we do have the ability to form some really powerful left-right coalitions. Normally, they hate the things that we hate for all the wrong reasons. But when it comes down to a vote, nobody ever asks them why they voted. It's just, did they vote yes or no? Thank heavens. And then also, what is it that needs to happen in order that we can challenge the U.S.-Saudi relationship, which has been very, very toxic for Saudi Arabia. And I think we all know and remember our parents saying, be careful of the company you keep. And that has been very, very true. I want to introduce my panelists, and then that will give them the opportunity to quickly pass the microphone back and forth and share whatever it is that they wish. At the end, we've got Julianne Hill. Julianne is a fellow for the legal action charity Reprieve UK. She works on death penalty cases in many parts of the world, including Saudi Arabia and Iran, Pakistan, and, as I said, unfortunately, in the U.S. Before joining Reprieve, she worked with legal services and charitable organizations in India, Thailand, and South Africa. She does hold a degree from Harvard, and her work in Saudi focuses on the death penalty. She's going to be providing us some overall statistics about what's going on. So, Julianne. Oh, all right.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank Code Pink and all of the organizers of this incredible summit, and I'm very honored to be here and engaging in these discussions with you all. I work for the human rights organization Reprieve. We are based in London, and we do focus on the death penalty in many parts of the world. Saudi Arabia, we've recently seen a recent surge of executions there. They're currently the 4th top executing country in the world, behind Iran, Pakistan, and China. And last year, they executed 158 people. As many of you will know, on January 2nd of this year, there was a mass execution of 47 people in one day. And to date, this year, there's been 63 executions, which means that if they keep up at this pace, there will be more than 300 people executed in 2016 alone. Methods of execution, we discussed just on the last panel that stoning is still on the books. The most common execution method is beheading, and also there is sometimes beheading followed by crucifixion, which is where the individual's decapitated body will be put on display in a public square for several days after the execution. There are very, very serious problems with the way that the death penalty is carried out in Saudi Arabia. They are consistently violating international minimum due process standards, as well as their own domestic law. And we could talk about this for several hours, but I'm just going to focus on what I see as the three most egregious violations during my few minutes here. So first of all, the death penalty is most often used for people who have committed nonviolent offenses. Most often these offenses are drug crimes or political dissent. We issued a report in October of last year, and we found that 72% of people facing execution were on death row for nonviolent offenses. And in the year preceding the report, 69% of all people who had been executed were executed for nonviolent offenses. We've specifically seen a rise in people speaking out, in death sentences for people speaking out against the government. These cases are being referred to the Specialized Criminal Court, or the SCC. And the SCC's mandate is actually to try terrorism cases. But what it actually is a political court. And the message is very clear. If you speak out against the government, you will be sentenced to death. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the use of torture to extract confessions. Most often confessions are the sole basis of conviction and death sentences in Saudi Arabia. And we're currently working on the cases of 3 juveniles who were coerced into signing confessions and subsequently sentenced to death and are all currently on death row. Their names are Dawood al-Marhoun, Ali al-Nimr, and Abdullah al-Zaher. And in the case of Dawood, he was arrested at the hospital while he was undergoing treatment for an eye injury. He was arrested without a warrant, which is actually in violation of Saudi's domestic law. He was then taken to a prison and held incommunicado for a week. He was not given access to a lawyer, to his family, to anyone from the outside world, and he was tortured. His hands and feet were severely and repeatedly beaten. He was suspended from the ceiling. He was hit where he had previously been shot in the leg by security forces, and he was also put in solitary confinement for a month. The purpose of all of this was to get him to sign a confession, which he did. Actually, he signed a blank piece of paper, which was then used in the SCC as the basis for his conviction. It was later filled out with a confession that he had never seen before. And after a series of secret hearings, which his lawyers were not informed of and which they were not present at, he was sentenced to death. Dawood's case is not special whatsoever. The use of torture is systematic. We've also seen cases where there are foreign nationals who do not read, write, or understand Arabic, and they will sign confessions that are in Arabic, and this is the sole basis of their conviction and death sentence, even though they have no idea what they signed. Essentially, the signature is all that the court needs. The SCC does not care how these confessions were obtained. It is irrelevant. And if your signature is on that piece of paper, that will serve as enough evidence to sentence you to death and execute you. Thirdly, I'll move on to what I see as one of the biggest problems, which is the execution of juveniles. As I was just speaking about, we are currently working on the cases of 3 people who were children at the time their alleged offenses occurred. Dawood was only 17 when he was arrested and tortured. And Ali al-Nimr and Abdullah Zaher have very similar stories. They were 17 and 15 at the time of their arrests, tortured into signing confessions, and then were sentenced to death based on trials that lacked all safeguards of due process. Actually, in the mass execution that occurred on January 2nd of this year, we know that at least 4 people were executed, even though they were juveniles at the time that they committed their offense. One of them was Mustafa Akbar. He was only 13 when he was arrested, and then he was convicted of terrorism charges because he had been recruited as a child soldier for ISIS, and he was executed. And another one is Ali al-Rib. He was 17 when he was arrested, and he was executed for attendance at a political protest. I guess just to finish off, the execution of juveniles is actually one of the things that is in violation of Saudi's domestic law, in addition to their international obligations. They are signatories to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which strictly prohibits execution of children. And they also have a special juvenile court system. Cases of juveniles are supposed to be referred to their juvenile courts, which have more of a focus on rehabilitation, actually take into account mitigation. The person as well as their parents are more involved in the proceedings. They are more likely to have access to a lawyer. And the judges are specially trained in juvenile justice in many cases. But what we're seeing is that in political cases, instead, these children are being referred directly to the SCC, where they are then tortured into signing their own death warrants. And as we stand now, the 3 juveniles that I've just spoken about are still on death row. They could be executed literally at any time. And the only thing, we believe, that has kept them alive this long and that kept them from being executed on January 2nd, along with the 47 other individuals, is the international attention that their cases have received. And with that, I will pass it on.
Thank you, Julianne. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Sharat Lynn with the San Jose Peace and Justice Center, right down the road from where I used to live in Fremont. He writes on global political economy, Middle East, South Asia, labor migration, and public health. He is a contributing author to the book Studies in Inequality and Social Justice. He has spent several years in Saudi Arabia. He was also in Tahrir Square during the 2009-2012. He witnessed the real beginning of the Lebanese Civil War. And he's going to focus on labor rights and how the U.S. bears some responsibility for the labor situation in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the nature that political opposition has taken. So, Dr. Lynn.
Well, thank you very much. My involvement in Saudi Arabia begins back in the 1980s, and I was working there for a number of years. And actually, I was actually effectively expelled from the kingdom for the crime of reporting an inconsistency in the practices of the agency that I was working for, which reports to the Royal Cabinet. And I mean, it was the main point is that I had gone around the hierarchy or the reporting structure to report this inconsistency, and so that's what happened. Now, as far as the labor system in Saudi Arabia is concerned, now we are all very concerned about the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia, and the executions, the way that people are punished for what elsewhere in the world would be minor crimes or not even crimes at all. But another picture, which is actually in a way much bigger than these sorts of obvious human rights abuses, is the system of migrant labor, of bringing labor from other countries, because it affects at least 4 million people. And these people are coming from all over the world, most of them from countries like Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, and other Arab countries. And so this is the legal migration. There's also a certain amount of undocumented migration that occurs, in which people Muslims come to Saudi Arabia for the purposes of Hajj. And I mean, I've written articles on this kind of labor migration, particularly from South Asia. And they go for Hajj. As part of it, it's actually the culmination of a very long migration from Bangladesh through India, Pakistan, ending up in Saudi Arabia. They get there, and one of the few sanctuary cities in Saudi Arabia is Mecca, just because of its holiness. And so the authorities are more reluctant to sort of clamp down on undocumented migration there. But I want to focus mainly on the legal migration. And the system of labor that exists in Saudi Arabia is actually one that this is not something I'm just simply going to blame the royal family for. This is something that actually originates with US involvement. And this goes back to the 1920s when oil was discovered and the 4 US oil companies formed a consortium called Aramco, which today is known as Saudi Aramco. And they established a labor system which basically was to rationalize the pay and the compensation that employees from all these different parts of the world would receive. And so they categorized workers according to where they came from and various other criteria. And then the government agencies basically adopted this system. And so, for example, a typical Saudi government agency will have maybe 15 categories of different employees. Now, there's actually a matrix, right? So on one line of the matrix, you have the pay grades. So people are paid according to different grades, and then there are different steps. And then you have a whole other set of these for different categories. So in other words, you have one set for Saudi nationals. There's another scale for nationals that are hired from other Arab countries. There's another scale for Europeans. There's another scale for US people who are hired from the US. There's one from Canada, and so on and so forth. And there's another one for dependents. And so you have this immensely complex system, but the main point is that for the same work, different people from different parts of the world are getting paid very different salaries. And the thing that of course creates some resentment is the fact that for a Saudi national is not at the top of the scale. They're actually kind of at the low end. And so for many Saudis, upon realizing that they're part of a system that actually discriminates against them as Saudi citizens, find that they realize eventually that this is a system that is not only being perpetuated by the Saudi government, but that U.S. companies played a key role in doing. It's not just Saudi Aramco. A lot of things that were established afterwards, hospitals, universities, were done under management contracts with U.S. and European companies. And so they also replicated the system, sometimes in greater depth than the original. So this is part of what we, or I shouldn't say we, it's not the people in this room, but rather corporate America played a key role in creating a highly discriminatory system of employment in Saudi Arabia. So this system, now if a person has some grievances with their employment, yes, there is a mechanism that, over time, as some of the previous speakers have said, Saudi Arabia the government has tried to give the appearance of being progressive in the sense of responding to these problems and saying, okay, we've passed some new, actually it's not passed, but the king has decreed certain reforms to the labor law that will give more rights to workers. But the bottom line is that the employer controls everything. So when a worker comes in, is first hired, the employer takes their passport, and so that worker becomes, absolutely tied to that employer. And if a worker doesn't return to his or her job, then the employer issues a notice, publishes it in the newspaper saying that this employee has disappeared, and anyone else in the kingdom who dares to employ that worker will face the consequences. So, in other words, the labor system in Saudi Arabia ties that employee to that employer. So even though it's a capitalist system, it bears a resemblance to slavery because the worker does not have the freedom to change employers. So this labor system is being perpetuated in Saudi Arabia. Now I just wanted to turn a little bit to a slightly different topic, which is about some of the political opposition. And there's a lot of that I hear about, that the human rights situation and the Islamic militancy that's coming about is rooted in Wahhabism. Of course, if you actually go to Saudi Arabia, you will probably never hear this word, Wahhabism, right? And I agree with one of the previous speakers in saying that this all comes about because of the totalitarian government that is controlled by the royal family, is imposed upon a conservative society. So when movements come about where Saudi citizens want to protest, the first thing is that what they're protesting is for, they always frame it in terms of reform, not in terms of revolution. But I mean, some of them, like the Saudi, the movement for, the Islamic movement for reform, if you look at their Arabic language website, they're talking about just reform, very minor changes. And if you look at their English language website, they're talking about, we are ready to take power. And so these movements are there. I interviewed many Saudis, and they talked about their resentment at the royal family controlling everything, and that this has nothing to do with Islam. So I'm sure we'll have more chance to discuss this as the conference goes on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lind. Thank you very much. Our final panelist is Sanjeev Barry, who's the Advocacy Director for Middle East North Africa Issues at Amnesty International. He got his BA degree from Berkeley and his Master of Public Administration from Harvard Kennedy School, and he was a Harvard Public Service Fellow. He's the 2007 recipient of the Asian Law Alliance Community Impact Award, and he's received commendations from the California State Senate and the Assembly for his human rights advocacy. So, Sunjeev, come on down. Welcome.
Let's see if I can set my glass of water here without spilling it. Well, thank you for that, and thanks to all of the panelists who've already spoken today. I mean, this has been a fantastic opportunity for me to learn from so many different people who've spent so much time on such an array of issues. I also want to say thank you to Code Pink and all the members and organizers with Code Pink who made this possible. I mean, this is a first-time event, and it's an important moment, I think, in the days, months, and years ahead. It's very easy sometimes to forget just how interpersonal and how basic the beginnings of movements can be. And I'm not speaking about challenges to Saudi human rights violations writ large, but the beginnings in the US for expressions of solidarity with those who've already been doing many years of hard work and struggle. So thank you to everybody here who's made this possible. And on behalf of Amnesty International, thanks to all of you who've also been involved with Amnesty International as members, supporters, perhaps past board members. We thank you as well. So this weekend is the beginning of a long conversation that will hopefully lead to specific outcomes and ways that we can continue acting in solidarity with people in Saudi Arabia who are standing up for their freedoms or seek to stand up to their freedoms despite overwhelming odds and despite another government, namely the government many of us in this country live under, which has at best done very little to advance human rights in Saudi Arabia, and at worst stood in the way or even handed the guns and bombs to those who make human rights violations possible. I want to talk for just about a couple of specific areas. We've heard a lot about the use of the death penalty in Saudi Arabia. We've learned a lot today about many of the details with regards to the challenges for women's human rights in Saudi Arabia, labor rights, and some other issues as well. I want to talk a little bit about one set of human rights violations in Saudi Arabia, the crackdowns on civil society, and then I also want to take the gaze a little bit outward towards the human rights violations that the government of Saudi Arabia is engaged in next door in Yemen with the support of the United States. And then finally, thank you, and then finally to talk a little bit about what has been done so far and what some possible opportunities are that we can pursue going into tomorrow as people break out into discussion groups. So first of all, the crackdown on civil society in Saudi Arabia. I mean, many people here are already well aware of this, and there are people who've spoken today who are in direct contact with or directly related to people who are right now suffering and living day to day in Saudi Arabian prisons. The name Raif Badawi, of course, is one that many people know, the Saudi Arabian blogger, 10 years in prison, 1,000 lashes. Many people may also know the name of his lawyer, Walid Abu al-Khair, a man who is a human rights advocate and lawyer in Saudi Arabia, 15-year prison sentence. And then, of course, there are the many people that Walid Abu al-Khair is part of a community of in terms of human rights advocates in Saudi Arabia, some of whom are under an organization that in English is spelled ACPRA, the Association for Civil and Political Rights in Saudi Arabia. All of the leaders of ACPRA today are in prison or are facing criminal charges or have been detained. And we're talking long, multi-year sentences. This is a full-throttle crackdown on anyone who dares to advocate for human rights in Saudi Arabia. One of the particular things to keep in mind with regards to many of the individuals from this community of ACPRA and those who work with them is that some of them have made the argument within Saudi Arabia that human rights are Islamically derived. They come from the Quran, they come from Islamic doctrine, and they're making an argument for the roots of human rights that is sometimes different than the arguments that organizations like Amnesty International might make, that people in Western universities might make, that those from the Western legal canon might make, in terms of international law, international treaties, etc. They are arguing for an indigenous, some of them are arguing for an indigenous Islamic root to human rights principles. And there are those who argue that the reason why the Saudi Arabian monarchy has come down so hard on them is because they see this argument as a threat. And so when you hear those in potentially Islamophobic discourse in the United States say things like, where are the Muslim reformers? Well, a major ally of the United States has put them in prison. And it's something to think about, you know, as we elevate the arguments of how we can be sophisticated and thoughtful in our solidarity with those who are struggling as we seek to make sure our own government does not do damage along the way. So that's one thing to think about in terms of this crackdown on civil society. Another is what are called these so-called counterterrorism courts, these specialized criminal courts that we've heard of. These are some of the courts that are established in the context of Saudi Arabia's so-called cooperation in the so-called crackdown on terrorism, something that Western governments, including the US government, have often praised. And these courts are used frequently to criminalize peaceful, nonviolent dissent. Walid Abu al-Khair, the human rights lawyer facing with the 15-year prison sentence, convicted in one of the specialized criminal courts. So when you hear this sort of rebuttal, well, we need Saudi Arabia's government to be an ally in the war on terror, they are manipulating this language and using it to criminalize legitimate dissent inside the country and put people in jail for many, many years on end. It goes beyond this. In Saudi Arabia, all public gatherings, including peaceful demonstrations, are prohibited under an order by the Ministry of the Interior in 2011. In November of 2015, the government established a law of associations. You could say, you know, at the most charitable level, their version of a nonprofit law, except for these factors. It excludes any mention of human rights. The government has the power to deny licenses to new organizations and to disband them if deemed to be, quote, harming national unity, end quote. So these are the ways in which the laws have been established to further support this crackdown on civil society voices. Not only that, but as I mentioned before, authorities continue to ban independent human rights associations and imprison founding members, as with the membership and the leadership of ACPRA. So this covers some of the many ways in which the Saudi Arabian monarchy and its institutions and government shut down independent domestic voices that are calling for reforms in ways that resonate within Saudi Arabian society. Many of the people involved in these communities are very well-liked and popular within the country. They have many Twitter followers, they're followed widely, their ideas resonate, and they've been put in prison. I also want to take a moment to shift to another set of human rights violations that are quite egregious that the Saudi Arabian government is involved in with the backing of the United States. And this is in the context of the Saudi Arabian government and military-led coalition attacks in Yemen. This is an air war that the Saudi Arabian government and its partners have launched in Yemen in response to or following a Yemeni political faction, the Houthis, sweeping through Yemen and kicking out the prior government that was Saudi Arabia-backed. Fine, political conflict, potentially civil war, but here's what happened with the Saudi Arabian government's air war as a consequence. They declared an entire governorate or province of Yemen, the Sada province, a military target. No differentiation between military targets or civilians. Homes, hospitals, schools bombed. Amnesty International staff, some of my colleagues were on the ground there, watching and warily as they were watching the Saudi planes above as they were moving through parts of the country, documenting the violations on the ground. The consequence of this conflict is that over the past year or more, 35,000 people have been killed in Yemen. In less than a year, more than 2.5 million people have lost their homes. This is a vast amount of damage and destruction to have happened. And if it weren't for potentially Western media fatigue and Western audiences fatigue, we would know so much more about this. Unfortunately, there's so many other tragedies happening right now as well in the context of Syria and et cetera that most people don't even know. But here's the crazy thing. Even as the Saudi Arabian government and its Gulf national allies across the Gulf states have been waging this war, the United States, under the Obama administration, approved a $1.2 billion bomb sale to the Saudi Arabian government with thousands of bombs and warheads that would essentially replenish their stocks. This is happening right now. The arms sale has been approved, the manufacturing process is beginning, and while it will take some time for those bombs to get to Saudi Arabia, the reality is that when a government is engaged in this kind of full-throttle bombardment of a neighboring country, and it knows that the United States is going to replenish its stocks, there is no pressure to change the behavior of the government in terms of the mass bombardment. It's a green light for whatever the claims are of the US government otherwise. The coalition's airstrikes have killed and injured thousands of civilians, destroyed civilian homes and infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, markets, and factories. And they've even targeted civilian and humanitarian assistance vehicles, and of course made a dire humanitarian situation in Yemen even worse. And one of the interesting things is that there's no hiding the US government's role in this. I just went yesterday to state.gov, the US State Department's website. I searched Saudi Arabia, arms sale, and then here comes the statement I was looking for from March 1st, just a couple days ago, where the US government clearly states Saudi Arabia is the United States' largest foreign military sales customer with nearly $100 billion in active foreign military sales cases. In November 2015, the U.S. approved a possible foreign military sale case to Saudi Arabia for an estimated cost of $1.29 billion. This is just in broad daylight. This is not something that's being hidden. This is being made easily public. So given all of this, and I want to leave some time for questions, what have critics attempted to do? First, members of Congress at different points in time have rallied in different ways to challenge various aspects of Saudi Arabian human rights. Of course, they haven't done so in the context of the arms sales. Very few have done so in the context of the arms sales, which shows to you what happens when American military sales and profits are on the table. But in 2014, some 50 members of Congress, through lobbying and grassroots pressure and a coalition of organizations, sent a letter to President Obama urging him to stand up for a whole range of human rights issues when he visited Riyadh, Saudi Arabia in 2014. 8 senators signed a letter to King Salman regarding Raif Badawi and Walid Abu al-Khair's cases. Another 67 members of Congress signed a letter last year to King Salman. And all of this happened because a cross-section of voices came together. Human rights advocates, advocates for women's human rights, but also people being willing to reach across traditional ideological boundaries, as has been alluded to earlier today, so that those who are advocates for religious minorities' freedoms, particularly in the United States in the context of Christian organizations, also came on board. And as a consequence, you had Republicans and Democrats in Congress raising these issues. Now, obviously, this is not nearly enough. Obviously, this has not changed dramatically the arc of the reality on the ground. But it shows what is possible. There are very few strong ideological allies within the American grassroots with the behavior of the Saudi Arabian government. They're waiting, people are waiting for a substantive, strong challenge. And people in this room have an opportunity over the next couple of days to come up with some of the potential vehicles for this so that those 50 members of Congress, those 60 members of Congress can be made to not just sign statements or letters, which can be helpful, but to also cut off the arms sales and then to go from there. Thank you. Arms sales that are not just devastating life in Yemen, but can also be used by internal police and security forces inside Saudi Arabia when they arrest somebody, when they take a woman who's attempting to drive and put her in jail, et cetera, et cetera. And to provide people with the kind of vehicles that are necessary politically to make these challenges possible. And I think folks in this room have a really unique opportunity from a place of principled advocacy to reach out into different communities in the United States who are politicized in different ways. Those who might care from a religious perspective about the religious freedom of Christian minorities who are Filipino laborers in Saudi Arabia, who might not be allowed to practice. Those who are strong advocates for women's human rights and can be helped in terms of playing strong solidarity roles as opposed to sort of what might be called saviorism, if that makes sense. Folks who are, advocates for freedom of speech. There are a lot of different ways to do this. There are challenges that can be put to American companies. Are you enforcing Saudi human rights violations in your workplace? Are you handing over Wi-Fi data in Saudi Arabia? Are you, as Sharat has already spoken to, are you enforcing unjust labor laws? Do you care if Saudi women are able to drive the cars that you're selling in Saudi Arabia or not? There are a whole host of opportunities to be brainstormed. And once these opportunities are brought forward, my personal feeling is that there will be an eruption of political solidarity and support that will challenge the status quo. And I think folks here in this room have a unique opportunity to play in getting that started. So thank you.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Wonderful. Thank you, panel. I'm going to make a very, very quick statement, and then, yes, we will be taking questions. The reason the United States has never ratified CEDAW, the CEDAW Treaty, is the United States is not qualified to ratify the CEDAW Treaty. In order to ratify CEDAW, the United States would need to have ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, and they never did it. Right. All right, now, questions. Right. I was going to say the person standing. Oh, Ingrid. Press your microphone button.
Yes. Is this working?
No, can't hear you.
Don't hold it down.
Hold it.
Okay. Sunjeev mentioned arms sales. But the U.S. is also providing intelligence for these Saudi airstrikes. Could you tell us what the legal basis is that we are actually actively engaged in this war on Yemen?
So, from Amnesty International's perspective, there is no legal basis. So I don't know what their arguments are. I do know what their arguments are. I've had the privilege or misfortune of engaging folks in off-the-record conversations. And they have different justifications. Their arguments are that there are disputed narratives as to what was a target and what wasn't, et cetera, et cetera. But there is no legal justification. I mean, when there's a substantial risk of arms being used in a serious violation of human rights, nobody should be supplying arms to a party that would be doing that. And our basic message ought to be, the U.S. should not be providing weapons to a repressive government that has a clear record of cracking down on people at home and is dropping bombs left and right in a neighboring country. None of this is, and certainly there should be an arms embargo on Israel and armed Palestinian groups. One other thing I would say on this that I think is a way to engage folks who may not come from the same place as many people in this room, but may be concerned about security issues. The reckless mass bombardment of Yemen is expanding the operating space for Al-Qaeda and ISIS. This is a fact. And the sort of strange blank check of military support that the United States is giving Saudi Arabia is actually in direct conflict with, in terms of its impacts in political terms, a direct conflict with the stated goals of U.S. presidencies with regards to ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
Next question.
Yeah, this is for Sunjeev. I thank you for this wonderful presentation. I just have one question for you. You talked about media fatigue on Yemen, and that sounds as if the media were fatigued from profound coverage of the assault on Yemen. I think it is more like a complete lack of coverage, or even blockade of coverage. Thank you.
Fair enough. I did not mean to give folks in the media a free pass.
The gentleman standing up in the blue.
We have no time, so you better start talking.
Great. I'd like to ask all of the panelists, there's significant momentum that's built up in the U.S. Congress demanding the release of the classified sections of the original 9/11 report that reveals the Saudi government's direct involvement in financing and other ways of the original 9/11 attacks. And it strikes me that if we need to break the Saudi-American ties, that this is an issue that still carries profound weight with the American people. And I would suggest that there's bills in both houses of Congress demanding the declassification. Well over 100 members of the House and Senate have read those documents and concluded that it's simply a political cover-up of the Bush administration's collusion with the Saudis and preventing the release of the evidence that would have a profound impact on the entire American attitude towards Saudi Arabia. I was wondering if the panelists would care to comment.
Well, it's certainly an issue that has been on my mind. I mean, it's much broader than that. As far as the Saudi involvement actually is very likely to be very complex, in which part of it is a direct government involvement, and partly it is the Saudi government allowing financial aid to go. I mean, it's not just dating back to 9/11, but of course to ISIS and Al-Qaeda from non-governmental sources within Saudi Arabia. There's a lot more. I mean, the one thing that I think we absolutely need to mention here in this conference is the Saudi role in Bahrain. And in 2011 March, the Saudis went in to crush the uprising in Bahrain. We were led to believe that it was at the invitation of the Bahraini leadership. We now know that the Saudi government, in fact, pressured the Bahrain, said, "You need us, and we're going to come." And the U.S. government's role has been, well, it's incredible, because the Elaine Brown, who is the U.S. representative to the UN Human Rights Council, was asked the question, okay, you've taken up the issues of human rights during the Arab Spring of Syria, Libya, Yemen, all these other places, but you never mentioned Bahrain. And she said, well, we did not receive the green light from the Obama administration, from the White House, to pursue that.
I'll just say one thing as well on the 9/11 legislation. I mean, as I mentioned before, there are unique opportunities for people in this room to, from a place of principle, engage ideologically diverse partners in challenging the U.S.-Saudi relationship. all victims and survivors of armed attacks, terrorist attacks, deserve to have access to information as to what happened, whether you're talking about Yemenis or American victims or survivors of the 9/11 attacks. And that bill and those classified documents, those classified documents stand in the way of American victims and survivors of the September 11th attacks getting more information about what happened. And there's a principled way for folks in this room to speak to that language, to speak to that narrative, and to align and bring into this nascent coalition people who are thinking about these issues from other angles.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Faisal Shamri. I'm a Saudi journalist. I write political analysis. So I give the benefit of the doubt to Code Pink for this great event. However, it's one-sided event. It's only one point of view and one objective. Its type of campaign it's a smear campaign. Everybody got together to smear my beloved country. Saudi Arabia is a country like any other country. There is positive, there is negative, and we're developing and improving every single year. So to put one narrative and one point of view throughout the day is unjust even for the audience.
I want to say one thing in response to that. I mean, I think you're confusing the government and country. I mean, there's a lot of criticism today with regards to the Saudi Arabian government, I'll give you that. But you are equating the government and the country, and there have been Saudis who've already spoken, people from Saudi Arabia have already spoken today who've made a clear differentiation between the two. Criticizing the US government is not the same as criticizing US society, though there are aspects of both that could, be legitimate targets of criticism. Same with Saudi Arabia.
I just want to respond, because you might not have been here when I addressed this issue as we opened up, to say that we invited not only people from the Saudi embassy, we begged them to come here and speak. We begged other Saudis with different viewpoints to come and speak. None of them agreed to speak. So we're glad you're here, and we wish that there would be more of a dialogue. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, and I want to thank all the members of our panel, Julianne, Sunjeev, and Sharat. And for a panel, please, on human rights in Saudi Arabia.
So now we're going to attempt the impossible here. We can do it, which is to go out and really fast grab your lunch and come back in here quietly.